On the night of 8th of June 2024, I set up to image the Veil Nebula, specifically the Western Veil Nebula. It's located in the constellation Cygnus with an apparent magnitude of 7.0 exactly. It has a radius of approximately 50 to 65 light years, and its distance away from the Earth has been measured between 1,200 to 5,800 light years. A very recent measurement places it around 2,400 light years away. The nebula itself is a diffuse nebula, and it's a remnant of a supernova, which is calculated to have exploded around 10,000 to 20,000 years ago. The setup I used to image the Western Veil Nebula was a Skywatcher Evostar 72 ED refractor telescope, the Skywatcher EQ3 goto tracking mount, a DSLR EOS 4000D camera, and there was no guide scope, no filters or anything like that used for this image at all. I have recently purchased a guide scope and camera, so I expect to be able to share some longer exposure images very soon. I began setting up the telescope around 9 PM and I began the alignment procedures around 11 PM. I had a bit of an issue when it came to polar alignment, as I can't see the North Star Polaris from my garden, so I had to use the Skywatcher's built-in polar correction system. So you perform a 3-star alignment, as you normally would do. That's easy enough from a garden, so long as there's not too many high trees and that kind of thing. And then you go onto the hand control and you select polar alignment corrector, you point it at a star, so in this case I used Vega, and it slews away from the position of the star and kind of works out how much you're out by, and you just adjust the polar dials basically on the right ascension and the declination, and that allows you to correct your polar alignment without using the North Star. It's very handy. I did have to do this twice, as the first time round the polar alignment wasn't quite right, but on the second attempt it went perfectly. At around 11:45 PM, I began imaging the Western Veil Nebula. The image settings I used were 45-second sub-exposures, so a sub-exposure is how long one image is, and you stack these to get a total exposure time, which I believe for this image was around 2 hours. And I used an ISO of 800. I left the telescope running till around 3 AM, as past this point, light pollution from the sun rising started becoming quite prevalent and was ruining the images. The only hiccup of the night whilst imaging came from doing a battery change for the camera halfway through. I accidentally knocked the camera out of orientation, so the stars went a bit skewed. Thankfully, the software I use, Deep Sky Stacker, to stack the images on top of one another, is able to account for this, so there was no effect at all on the final image. So my main issues of the night really started when it came to taking the calibration frames. If you didn't know, when it comes to astrophotography, you need to take these calibration frames to remove any imperfections from your images. So you need to account for thermal and electronic noise of the sensor and any dust you may have on your sensor or the telescope lens itself. To account for the thermal noise, you take what's called dark frames, which are the exact same exposure time, ISO, and these are temperature dependent as well, so you've really got to take these the moment you're done imaging for the night. The bias frames are the same ISO but as quick of an exposure as possible, so in the case of the EOS 4000D camera, this is 1/4000th of a second, and the flat frames are taken at the same ISO. However, you need to point these at like a white screen, and I usually put a white cloth over the telescope, point it at an evenly lit white screen and put my camera in ambience priority mode, and this allows you to detect any imperfections on the lens or sensor. And in Deep Sky Stacker, it will stack all of these calibration frames on the images to remove any imperfections. And so the issues that arose were the fact that I completely forgot to take any calibration frames initially. I packed up everything, came in, and then I realised, so I quickly rushed back outside with the camera, and I set up to start imaging the dark frames. And since these are temperature dependent, I wanted to get this done as quickly as possible, frankly, because I didn't want the temperature to affect the noise on the sensor. Afterwards, I took the bias frames and I came in and took the flat frames. You're not really supposed to take the flat frames after you've taken your equipment apart, because other dust and particulates can end up on the sensor or the lens. I went ahead and done this anyway. I didn't know this at the time, but I accidentally took them in the wrong settings. They weren't in RAW format, I think they were in JPEG, and the ISO was wrong. So eventually later on I did have to come and correct this. And I believe the reason for all of these mistakes was because I was quite tired by this point. I'd been awake an awfully long time, so I was quite fatigued and forgetful. So after I concluded imaging, I immediately sat down to begin the pre-processing of the images by loading all the calibration frames and light frames into Deep Sky Stacker. You can see here it's rotating the image basically to adjust for any errors that came up, which there were some where I knocked the camera out of orientation, but as done there, it's completely dealt with it. It's completely fine. And that was the first stack. I believe that was with the errored image, but I decided to go ahead and try edit it anyway. It didn't look horrendously bad, but I wasn't quite happy with stuff still, and I decided to go through with restacking the flat frames anyway, so this is what this whole process here is. It effectively came back with the same type of image, but any imperfections would have hopefully been dealt with from the flat frames. There's the restacked image. I went ahead and edited this one, and I will post the image I got here. However, the end result I wasn't entirely happy with, so I did go ahead and the next day I re-edited the image, and I got one that I was actually very, very happy with. And you will see the process of editing that one now. And so this was the final image captured and processed, the Western Veil Nebula NGC 6960. It has a total exposure time of around 2 hours, taken at 45-second sub-exposures, and was taken at an ISO of 800.